In May of this year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited Pope Francis at the Vatican. At the heart of his audience with the Pope was a request. Trudeau asked Pope Francis to issue a public apology for the Catholic Church's role in establishing and running residential schools in Canada. Such an apology is among the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the troubled history of the Catholic Church and Indigenous people stretches back centuries. The words were written more than 500 years ago. Any non-Christian people discovered by European explorers were to be vanquished and subdued. Direct quote, subjugated and brought to the faith. And it didn't stop with explorers. The Vatican directives became the basis of centuries of discriminatory laws in both Canada and the United States. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is a historian and activist in San Francisco. She has worked with the international Indigenous movement for more than 40 years. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Mary.
So the Pope issues a papal bull being an old word referring to the lead seal on the document, and it's called the Doctrine of Discovery. We've put a few lines from the doctrine on tape just to get a sense of what this is. Here it is.
Among other works, well-pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest. That in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread. That the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself.
That barbarous nations be overthrown. The Doctrine of Discovery, when you read portions of it, it sounds like a directive from the Church to convert and or slaughter the inhabitants of the new lands. Is that overstating it?
Well, in the case of Columbus, because Columbus did say that these people had some attributes, they would be very easy to conquer. And then they sent, with Cortez, when they sent the big colonizing venture in 1518, De las Casas, the Dominican friar, was on board to determine whether or not the people they were going to conquer had souls or not and could be converted. Because if they didn't have souls, if they were savages, they couldn't be converted. So they then had 60 years of debates in Spain, legal debates about whether or not the indigenous Americans had souls. You have to understand that the church and the state both were colonizers, and they each had economic interests. So they wanted the labor of the native people. And for them to get that, they had to have, they had to convince the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope, that these people had souls.
In the minds of the monarchies, in the minds of church authorities, would this have been more than a quest for land? Are we talking about a quest for souls as well, just to find people and convert them to Christianity?
No, not really. It was a quest for domination, looting, taking the wealth, administering. Settler colonialism really was an invention of the British later on, who carried the Doctrine of Discovery for their own. But they in North America, their North American colonies, created a settler colonialism. But it definitely was to control those people and to the right to take all their resources and any of their land that they did wish to take.
So the doctrine became the foundation of a number of laws in the United States and in Canada over the centuries.
Absolutely.
Quite recently in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that the inspiration for residential schools could be traced back to the Doctrine of Discovery. It's that far-reaching?
Absolutely, that they had the right to break up families, children. This was true of the Spanish, and the mission systems they developed. They separated the families, separated the men and the women. They could do anything they wanted with the people, because not only did they own the land, but the people, their labor, everything. So it's completely entrenched in the legal system of both countries, and of course throughout Latin America as well. This is the basis for the boarding schools, the basis for genocide.
What do you think is the spiritual cost when the laws of the land regard you as less than human?
Well, it's, the moral fabric of the whole society is corrupted. Of course, the main victims are the people who are so regarded. The land is taken in order to make plantation land agribusiness worked by slave labor, but those slave bodies are also bought and sold and used as collateral, as exchange. And then the land, which cannot be separated from people or all other living things from the indigenous point of view, is broken down into small plots that are commodities, sold on a piece of paper as commodities. So just as the slave is sold as on a piece of paper, but it's a real body and it's real land. So we have a kind of analogy, between the land as a body of the native people and the body of slaves. But I think that applies also in Canada, where the people are removed from their relationship with what is a part of their body, and that is the land and the resources and all the other living things. So that's deeply traumatic and cannot be patched up without restoration of land, particularly sacred sites that have been taken very purposely to kill the religions. So, and then we have the policing thing. You have your Royal Canadian Mounties in Canada, and you have the Texas Rangers and all these rangers, these different Tennessee Rangers under Jackson. And these are the kind of off-the-shelf enforcers who have really no controls on them. Often they don't even, at least the Rangers, don't even have a code of behavior. I think we understand the oppressive policing because of the slave patrols under the Cotton Kingdom and African Americans, but we understand less about the police violence, the numbers of incarcerated First Nations peoples and just killings, police killings and torture and all kinds of things that also create that trauma. But I do think the boarding schools overall is the one uppermost, in North America, unique to North America colonization, that is an institution that it's so wonderful that the First Nations people in Canada have done a thorough investigation of the boarding school system. It's just getting started here, and it doesn't really have the kind of support that First Nations were able to garner to get the government committed to it. But there's no real reconciliation without restitution.
Well, you've spent decades at the forefront of the push to have the Vatican apologize for the doctrine, to reject the substance of it. Why has this not happened? Why has the Church resisted?
Well, it's very interesting. From the very beginning, we have had conversations with lawyers from the Holy See, they call it in the UN, the Vatican.
Yes. And how would you characterize your dealings with the Holy See lawyers on this question?
They always sort of brush it off and say, they will bring it up at some meeting. But they have been doing that for years now. And instead of doing something, a few years after we first met with them, and then we met with them a lot, every time we're over there, they're easy to meet with. We're in the same hall. You don't have to go to a special place or anything. Same in New York, because they always have ambassadors there. And they're always, ambassadors are always willing to sit down and talk about anything, because that's their job. But they're also charming and, have ways of putting you off or saying they'll do something and then they don't do it. But 5 years later, in 1982, the Holy See made a proposal with Spain to celebrate in the United Nations the 500-year anniversary of Columbus in 1992. They wanted the UN to sponsor it. And I was sitting there, that was in New York at the General Assembly. I was sitting there and I heard this on my earphones in the translation, and I couldn't believe my ears. I said, what? Of course, I couldn't do anything. I'm sitting up in the, where we're not allowed to speak as non-governmental people. But then I looked, and in that room, a few seconds, a few beats, and all of the Africans stood up and walked out. It was the most incredible thing. And the European chair, I can't remember which country was the chair of the committee, said into the microphone, "What does Columbus have to do with Africa?" So, nothing but the transatlantic slave trade, that started. He took the first Africans to the Americas. So we had to fight that. So not only did they not do anything, they invoked the Doctrine of Discovery to be celebrated in the UN. Of course, the Africans came back and very angrily made a statement about colonialism should not be celebrated in the UN. They even mentioned the genocide against the native people of the Western Hemisphere and the transatlantic slave trade. So that shut them up. It wasn't going to go anywhere. But all of the Western countries were supporting that without a clue. They had a discussion about it, teasing each other who was first. And Spain was saying they were first, and the Irish ambassador said, "No, we had people over there," and then the Norwegian, with the Vikings, and they were all laughing and talking. And then these Africans rose up. So, that nipped that in the bud, but they went ahead and spent all this money celebrating this, what they called, an encounter with the peoples of the Americas and the, gift of civilization and Christianity. A gift, not colonialism. So it's still just embedded. And the U.S. Supreme Court.
Do you think this has reached Pope Francis? Do you think you would have
Of course it has. He's been the worst because his answer, he didn't answer anyone in person, was to canonize the colonizer of California. To canonize him when he was here, on his acclaimed visit. That's never happened before. Some pretty bad people have been canonized, but never a colonizer. And Junipero Serra was the colonizer because they gave those Indians to the church, and the church gave orders to the army. And Junipero Serra accompanied the army out to capture children and take them into the missions, and then their parents would come to get them out, and they would lock them in. So they were imprisoned in these missions and made to work and almost starve and dying at young ages. I mean, this is one of the most horrible genocides of all of colonialism, and he canonized Junipero Serra. It was really dispiriting to see these things be reinforced in all of these actions,
You've been working on this for a very long time. Can you tell me why it is important to you?
Well, in my book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, I argue that this history is completely suppressed, in all of our countries, but especially the United States, a role in the world. And of course it has Canada as a sidekick, and, no doubt about that. But the United States, the practice of dominion, of dominating, of colonizing, of genocide, it leads to a deep social psychosis. There's generational trauma for Native people. We know that of descendant of enslaved Africans. But there's also the psychosis of the colonizer.
What is the social psychosis? Can you explain that?
It appears in the United States in the gun culture, which goes back to the militias, which is also enshrined in the Constitution, the Second Amendment, the right to have militias. And it really means what it says. And these people still see themselves, the descendants of the old settlers, as having to control Native Americans, Mexicans, and African Americans in particular, those that they have defeated and crushed and colonized, that they have to keep them down. And I think only if people understand the sources of this, and only Native people know this story. They're the only ones who can give testimony to it. And I found with this book, I've been traveling since it came out in September last year. I've gotten so many invitations, I try to do everything I possibly can because I have found this book, which just straight out tells this story, people find very liberating. And I mean, I think Native people appreciate it because they pretty much already know it, but they're glad to see it in a concise form that they can make use of. But to non-First Nations people, and I was all over Canada as well traveling, and it's just amazing what a freeing of the mind it is to pull back those obfuscations, those curtains, and look into what's actually there.
Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, it's very good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.
Goodbye. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is a historian and lifelong activist. Her book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous People of the Americas, held at the United Nations office in Geneva. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is also the author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States.